Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring rationality, returning back to this topic that we explored so many months ago. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. There is always a danger in getting to know a writer exclusively from their writing, having never met them in person. And one of those people happens to be today's guest. I grew up in the shul of Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburger, who maybe some of our listeners remember. He was originally a Rav in Canada, in Toronto, I believe, in Sharei Shamayim, and he was the second editor of the journal Tradition after Rabbi Lamb. So when I was growing up, it was all over our shul. We would have these old tradition journals, and my grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Bakritsky, used to have the old issues all over his office. Actually, after he passed away, I got all those old issues. I didn't get a lot from my grandfather, but what I did get were all those old tradition journals, and they're absolutely treasure. I also think I got a first edition Reb Chaim Brisker Al Harambam. I don't know if that's worth anything. It was like kind of taped up and beat up. But I did get, and I've always treasured, my set of tradition, the tradition journals, and I've had them all, and I grew up reading them. Really from a pretty young age. Tradition was pretty highfalutin modern orthodoxese, which is a language, modern orthodoxese. You have words like ontology and epistemology. I think the first time I learned the word axiomatic was from an essay written by a Rosh Yeshiva in YU, Rav Meir Twersky, who wrote an article about the Sefer HaChinuch that begins with, I think it was even in the title, axiomatic. And I remember looking it up in the dictionary. It was probably in 9th or 10th grade. And I would read just articles, issues, month after month, and I really love them. There's one writer who I knew I always wanted to love, but sometimes struggled quite mightily to get to the depths of what he was saying, and that was Rabbi Shalom Carmy. Rabbi Shalom Carmy has this style of writing that is so sophisticated, so creative, so deeply thoughtful, almost like when the old romantic movement, the way he writes about religion is almost inimitable. I haven't seen anybody write about davening, about Yiras Shamayim, about topics of the awe and relationship with God, quite like Rav Carmy. And when I used to read Rav Carmy's writings, I guess in my head I conjured up this image, honestly, like the person on the box of Quaker Oats. Like, remember that old Quaker-looking person? I lived across the street from somebody else named Carmy Schwartz, who always still, to this very day, when I think of davening on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I hear Carmy Schwartz's voice. See, I grew up with his voice. So I think as a young kid, I would get them mixed up. I thought they were the same person, Carmy Schwartz and Shalom Carmy. And Carmy Schwartz has this like regal, old world institutional leader to him. He's a former head of the Jewish Federation. And I remember when I finally came to Yeshiva University and met Rav Shalom Carmy, not Carmy Schwartz, but Shalom Carmy, for the first time, I was like, oh, I expected somebody, I don't know, who looked like one of the founding fathers, who looked like George Washington. And Rav Carmy is very plain, very understated, is not taken to fanciness. He doesn't look and storm into a room like you'd imagine an Isaac Newton or Voltaire or, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson, which is kind of in my head a combination of all these figures. He kind of sits unassuming, self-effacing, and is one of the most brilliant spokesmen for religious life and religious thought. We have spoken about many of his essays in the past. One that we have quoted many, many times that is available on Amazon is a brilliant essay that he wrote called Forgive Us, Father-in-Law, for We Know Not What to Think, Letter to a Philosophical Dropout from Orthodoxy. And that is available on Amazon, and it is an article that we discuss in this episode about somebody who dropped out from Orthodox Judaism exclusively for ideological reasons, for philosophical reasons. sense. He had a good thing going. He enjoyed it. He liked it, but he couldn't actually commit to the philosophical premises of this movement. And he has a way of articulating the methodology and the thought of how you arrive at religious conclusions that I find absolutely fascinating, which is why when I read his contribution to Jeff Bloom's book, Strauss, Spinoza, and Sinai, which we've been discussing so much, and his article, which we discuss in this episode, is very dismissive of this approach. In fact, in many ways, it reminds me of a voicemail that we got after our interview with Jeff.
David, I'm very excited that you returned to the rationality topic. I love this topic. But I always question all these arguments like Strauss, that we need to have different assumptions. We can't use the assumptions of modernity to prove faith, or that we can't use logic to prove God because logic is a creation in itself. We can't use our language to describe God because language is a creation and God is higher than that. All these kind of arguments are good for people who like where they are, they like Judaism, they feel in a good place, they just want to know that this might be true. It's not a total scam, it's not a farce, but for people who are raised that they are sacrificing themselves for the capital T truth, and they give away everything of their life for that because it's true. You can't just tell them that it might be true. I mean, Strauss is not an argument against Christianity. It's not an argument against Reform Judaism. It's not an argument against any other religion. It just tells us that Orthodox Judaism might be true. So if you like it, I can still be here. And no, it's not a total scam. Like this Jeff Bloom said, he wanted to be here. He just wanted to know that it might be true. But for someone who was raised, okay, give away everything from your life, being coiled for 10 years because this is the truth. You can't just tell them, oh, this might be true.
And I think this voicemail is very fair. It's basically asking, you're leaning too much on the experience and not enough on the philosophy. And I think that there's no one who's able to understand and better articulate how these two worlds intersect, complement one another, even though I don't think Rav Carmy agrees, as we will explore in this interview, that they can be entirely extricated from one another. I do believe he understands that these are two very different conversations. And I guess for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with Rav Carmy is one who is a fine wine that is best imbibed in writing. He is not a inspirational or motivational speaker. I think he'd be the first to admit that. There's something very understated and very uncomfortable with talking about himself. He has a phenomenal article. All of his articles are really phenomenal. I'm going to pull out a few, but one thing that makes his articles so amazing are their titles. He has the best titles for his articles. He has one article called Homer and the Bible, which I mentioned, which we discussed in our conversation with Rabbi Daniel Feldman in our series on humor. And his article on Homer and the Bible does not refer to the philosopher Homer, but of course to our beloved friend Homer Simpson, and recalls back a classic episode where Homer is using his own familial relationship and experience to get students' attention.
Well, you see, marriage is a lot like an orange. First, you have the skin, then the sweet, sweet innards.
I don't understand.
If I wanted to see a man eat an orange, I would have taken the orange eating class.
The eating of an orange is a lot like a good marriage.
Just eat the damn oranges!
This is terrible.
Oh, let's get out of here.
Terrible excuse for education.
Oh, I told Marge this wouldn't work the other night in bed.
In bed?
Huh?
Bed?
What?
Well,
So something wasn't working in bed, huh?
No, that's not what I meant. Marge and I always talk things over in bed. Like the other night, we were fighting about money.
And Rav Carmy laments what Homer Simpson is doing here, that so often we need to call upon our own, self-revelatory experiences in order to keep our students' attention, because they're not necessarily interested in the nitty-gritty conversations about the foundations of faith itself. But I do want to highlight a few of his most important articles that for our listeners, at least in writing, are worth reading if you've never been exposed to Rav Carmy's writing before. before, you can go to Tradition's website, which has an unbelievable catalog of all of the archives. Tradition's website, of course, is traditiononline.org, where you can find the classic Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought. Again, traditiononline.org. Rav Carmy was the editor of Tradition. First it was Rabbi Lamb, then Rabbi Walter Wurzberger, then Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Feldman, and we will get to him, of course, soon in this series, and finally Rav Carmy, and now it is our friend Jeff Sachs, who, of course, we will have on one of these days as well. But if you want to really explore Rav Carmy's thought, then I would begin with his editor's notes that he wrote for so many years in the introduction to Tradition, and I want to pull out some of his most important articles, which I think our listeners would gain from. There's one article that's entitled "A Room with a View, but a Room of Our Own," and this is an exploration of how traditional communities should explore biblical criticism. I think it's an absolutely brilliant essay. I'll just read a small part from it where he actually quotes from Rav Kook, as he does a great deal and quite often in his articles. He quotes Rav Kook in a letter. Rav Kook wrote, "And in general, this is an important rule in the struggle of ideas. We should not immediately refute any idea which comes to contradict anything in the Torah, but rather we should build the palace of Torah above it. In doing so, we are exalted by the Torah, and through this exaltation, the ideas are revealed, and thereafter, when we are not pressured by anything, we can confidently also struggle against it." This essay, Rav Carmy writes, can be read as an extended commentary on these inspiring words of Rav Kook. Our immediate and primary goal in confronting unsettling ideas is neither impatient or anxious refutation, nor is it paralyzed silence. We are to get on with our learning to integrate the challenging ideas, insofar as this is warranted, into the seamless fabric of our Derech HaLimud. What a beautiful articulation of the work that we strive to do in 1840 and the work that Rav Carmy did for so many years. And he concludes this article, once again, "A room with a view, but a room of our own," which is a rumination on approaching biblical criticism. He writes, "I return to Rav Kook's fascinating image of the palace of Torah that expropriates the challenge of ideas contradicting Torah. I wonder if these words do not intimidate us as much as they spur us on to greater and more authentic achievement. Unable to build a palace in one fell swoop, we build nothing and call for a deus ex machina," which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but basically means, some event that hopes to resolve a seemingly hopeless situation. To call for a deus ex machina to fill the void and get us off the hook. Our Derech HaLimud must be built example after example, brick on top of brick. Before we build the palace, we need a place where we can unpack our trunk, get our books out of storage, and back into our hands. We want a room with a view, since there is knowledge to be had that we want to have for our enhanced study of Torah. But we cannot do our work. We cannot prepare to build the palace unless we do it in a room of our own." And in some ways, I think this community is a room with a view, but a view of our own. It's a community of listeners, the community of 1840, such beautiful language of building that palace, even upon contradictions and difficulties that we may find in theology or in our lives, but still being willing to build that palace. There is another article that is absolutely brilliant and worth reading. Again, a rumination on some of these trickier theological conversations, and the title is absolutely adorable. It is called "A Peshat in the Dark, Reflections on the Age of Cary Grant." And of course, that header, "A Pshat in the Dark," is a awesome tier 1 pun on a shot in the dark. Just an absolutely brilliant title. And that article too, I would recommend. I'll just share one more aside from the ones that we've already shared, and that is of Eagle's Flight and Snail's Pace, which is really talking about how we approach modernity and religious thought in general. But again, I would go to Tradition Online and really take time. His articles on prayer, his articles on Yiras Shamayim, the awe of God, articulate a sort of authentic religious relationship that I have struggled to find anywhere else in the English language. And it's really an absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce our conversation with Rav Shalom Carmy. What we're talking about this month is we're revisiting a topic that we actually explored a few months ago, and that is how to ground, or can you ground, your religious faith, particularly Orthodox Judaism, in something rational. And we're talking about this topic this month through the lens of this incredible book that you contributed to called Strauss, Spinoza, and Sinai, Orthodox Questions and Modern Questions of Faith. And your approach in this article I found to be absolutely fascinating, and I want to talk about what you wrote here and then maybe broaden it to some of the other religious writing and ways that you've grappled with this issue. But essentially, your article and contribution, which is charmingly titled, let me just say, the titles for your articles are always the very best. It's an area I wish that you were recognized for more. I think my favorite was Homer and the Bible, which is a play on Homer, not the philosopher, but our favorite Homer Simpson. But all of your articles, I always love your titles. And in this article, which is entitled An Argument for Businessmen, you reject the notion that finding some plausible, possible way for grounding your faith, that it might possibly be true, is not the way to approach faith. It's the way that you would approach an actuarial table, but it's not the way that you would ground faith necessarily. The sentence that you write that jumped out at me: why asserting this bare possibility offers comfort to the believer or encourages belief in revelation is a mystery to me. So I guess the place to start is a very broad question that you have weighed on in so many eloquent ways, not just in this article, which is a critique, but in your books, in things that you've edited, which is, how would you ground someone's faith? If someone came to you and said, look, I like being an Orthodox Jew, it's nice, the kugel's nice, the cholent's nice, I like my shul, but this doesn't seem true or real. Where would you start to ground someone's faith?
To begin with, we have to start from experience. My criticism of Strauss is that his idea of the relevant kind of experience is very, very narrow. Because in the real world, there's a confluence of various factors that lead people to believe whatever it is they believe. We go elsewhere for a moment. The question is so-and-so my friend or not? I could give a kind of QED mathematical proof that the person has done X, Y, and Z on my behalf, therefore they must be my friend, and there's no other explanation of why they would have done the following things for me. Usually, though, there's a combination of different factors. A person may do beneficial things for me. I may enjoy the person's company, which is not really relevant because I can enjoy somebody's company and they can be very bad for me. I add up a variety of factors, and at a certain point I say, this is the way I see the world. This person is on my side.
My issue is that for a lot of people, the people who I've at least spoken to who are grappling with this question in their life, in their experience, they're not looking for a specific equation, but the problem is they have seriously conflicting evidence. And the most difficult evidence that I feel a lot of people grapple with, which isn't at the forefront of this book, though I know Jeff mentioned it as a part of his personal journey, the editor, are issues related to biblical criticism, are issues related to the fact that we don't have any clear revelation of God's presence. But I think the thing I hear most often that kind of chips away at people's sense of faith, or what I love, sense of friendship with faith, to use your language, is there seems to be evidence in direct contrast to the Orthodox values that we seem to preserve within our community.
I think for those people who are Ma'aminim, at least as I see it, there are three major areas that are important for them, or a combination of them. One is what I would call religious anthropology. You have a certain idea of what a human being is about. Put it very simply in the language of Pascal, we are both above the animals and below the animals. There's something in the dignity of the human being or in the transcendence of the human being that is more than simply biological. And at the same time, we're not angels. We're capable of great evil. Even those of us who are not evil people can be attracted by it, struggle with it, and so forth. Once you have such a conception of what a human being is about, and then you're willing to consider the possibility of God, and you ask yourself, what would God want of people? What kind of law would God give people? And the answer to me would be that it would be the kind of law, the kind of regimen that on the one hand would have some very specific commands in it. I'm not God's brother-in-law. I may be his son, but not his brother-in-law. Or as Kierkegaard put it, in a different conception, each person regarding himself is his father and not his uncle. So if God is God, then God makes demands. At the same time, my understanding of the human being is that a human being has to be engaged creatively, intellectually, emotionally. We are not simply robots doing what we're commanded. So such a divine revelation would involve specific demands, not all of which would make sense or appeal to us. It would also call upon us to be intellectually and emotionally engaged, to do some of our own work for ourselves, to be on our own. You would have an outlook that would recognize both the majesty of the human being and the debasement of the human being. It would have an individual quality. I relate to God as one individual, reaching out the alone to the alone, as Plotinus put it. It would also have a social dimension because human beings are social creatures. It would involve what we know of as Klal Yisrael. So those elements, I think, we call them anthropological. It means you look at the Torah and you look at other options, and within the Torah, you have something that appeals to and makes demands on the human being in a full complexity. For some people, that is a very powerful kind of argument. Biographically, I would say it was very important for me. Now, how do you reach such a conception? This could be a purely intuitive matter. You're born thinking that way, or it can have something to do with thinking and reading and so forth. You look at literature, you look at philosophy, you see the way the sharpest intellects and most eloquent intellects have tried to make sense of the world. And you situate yourself in that framework. If I would mention names outside of the world of general literature, if you really read Rav Soloveitchik's major works carefully, I think that's what's going to come across. He's describing a certain way of thinking, a certain mode of relationship. I think in strike one is realistic. The second area, which I think is very important for many people, is the story of Klal Yisrael. I could very well see Christians, and I know Christians, who may not be committed to Torah mitzvot, they are Christians, but if they look at the world, they say, somehow God's involvement is most manifest in the story of the Jewish people. Whether there's a later revelation through Christianity, that's not my concern right now, but they'll recognize that here is where God breaks into the world. And then thirdly is a question of what you might call religious experience. I don't like the word mysticism, but you could use it. Here are moments when people have a sense that coheres with these other factors. And that, again, you can claim it's an illusion. What I think about at 3:00 in the morning, maybe my imagination, but together with these other factors, I think it creates an entire way of thinking. And if you rely on that totality rather than on one particular line of reasoning, you will get a sense of what religious life is about. I think the problem for many people is that once they get down to work, they end up with a very narrow conception of what counts as evidence. Sometimes they'll be very skeptical. They'll always find reasons why this intuition or that intuition is worthless. Spinoza recognized that Jewish history is very special. He said, look, there's nothing really special about it. These people have their peculiar laws to which they are stubbornly attached. They have circumcision, which for certain reasons he lists separately from other mitzvot. And if you take that away from them, in a generation or two, they'll be just like everybody else. None of this uniqueness will evaporate. On the other hand, you can say, with all due respect to Spinoza, I know what I know, and I experience what I experience. Now, again, from the same people, when it comes to securing their academic position and personal relations and so on, they're not quite that skeptical. In those areas, it can be very down to earth and very intuitive.
With marriage, friendship, the examples you used earlier.
Yeah, and their people will be shrewd, and they'll ask different people, they'll weigh different factors, and sometimes they'll make terrible mistakes. The fact you're doing something the right way does not guarantee you get the right results.
I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned what had really inspired you, and there is something, we only know each other from a distance. I grew up reading your articles, probably not understanding them till I was much, much older, and even now I still, struggle to really plumb the depths, but you've always been a transcendent religious personality, really, in my own life. And I mean that not to flatter you, but really to show some measure of gratitude to the language that you've used to describe religious commitment and religious ideas has always been with a deep grandeur ever since I was a kid growing up in the shul of your mentor, Rabbi Walter Wurzberger, who I was too young to engage with as even, I was really a child. But my mother would always encourage me to reach out to him. But there's something about your career and your contribution to Orthodox thought that both has made you into an address for people who are seeking and grappling with doubt, and underneath, at times, I have detected not religious doubt, but almost doubt of fatigue of whether or not we can actually achieve the grandeur of the religious vision that you have embodied in so much of your writing and life. I'm talking about two things. One is an article that we have surfaced and come back to many times on 1840, and that is what you wrote for Atid, which to me is a cousin, if not a sibling, to what you are describing now and to your contribution, an argument for businessmen, and that is the article that you could buy on Amazon now. We've linked to it on more than one occasion. Forgive us, father-in-law, for we know not what to think. Letter to a philosophical dropout from Orthodoxy, which is presented as a letter ostensibly from a student who's grappling with these issues. Like, he doesn't have any gripes with the experiential world of Orthodoxy. His gripes with the truth, with the rationality of this community, and reached out to you. Now, we discussed a little bit beforehand. I asked you if this was an actual student, and you said you told me that it really, really was. But what fascinated me is who does reach out to you, and with what doubts do they reach out to you with? You've become an address of sorts for those in the know to reach out and try to find some religious truth. So I'm curious, before I get to the question about your own doubt that I have detected in your writings, ever so gently hovering beneath the surface, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit of this story about this student and maybe what kind of doubts you hear from people who reach out to you religiously.
This particular student, the question is not so much doubt as a kind of, tone deafness is too strong a word, but an unwillingness to engage experientially. Use the word experience before. To the degree that he likes being in the Orthodox community, you're right. As he put it to me, and I did not include that, I don't think I included that in the essay. He certainly would not want to disappoint his parents. He would not want to marry a woman who would not share that involvement. He would want to raise his children a certain way. That has nothing to do with religion. That has to do with lifestyle. I could like a certain lifestyle without any of the beliefs that would normally come along with that. His problem was that intellectually, none of this meant anything to him. The way his mind worked, any experiential argument for religion is refuted mineu ve automatically, because any such argument would only tell him about what he wants, not about what is true. If the human being is really isolated in that way, then whatever you look at is going to be a mirror. And the problem with that is, in his case, I don't think is narcissism, where you look in the mirror and you become infatuated with yourself. If I thought he was that kind of person, it would have been harder for me to respond at length. It's very easy to dismiss, say, this is wrong with him, that's wrong with him. But it was really an epistemological problem. No matter what you say, it's going to be what you say. And if it is at all possible to have a different way of thinking, then why should what you want to be true be any better than what somebody else wants to be true? That is a much broader problem than I think people realize. You take all people who are fascinated by the notion of virtual reality. It means the world is not true. Nothing exists. I am alone in the world. And the world happens to be arranged in such a way that I'm led to believe that X is true or Y is true. If you're thinking in those terms, you have a trap that not only will refute religious belief, because it doesn't refute religious belief, but will make it impossible imaginatively to relate to religious belief. Again, in history of philosophy, there are people who are solipsists. It's conceivable for me to think that other minds don't exist. Alvin Plantinga's first important book, The Important Philosophy of Religion, was God and Other Minds. He raised the question, how do I know that other people exist? And he recognized that many philosophers had great difficulty with that. So in that case, if I worship God, I'm really worshiping some idea in my head. If I'm married, I'm not really married to a person. I'm related to an idea. Again, I think most people don't think in those terms. Most people would say, if you only gave me a little more evidence this way or that way, then I would buy in. But underlying that seems to be the premise that no matter what kind of evidence you will give, or what kind of experience you'll give, you'll remain with yourself. My response was based on that premise, which means two things. One thing is that in that essay, I was arguing for much less than I appeared to be. I think I've said to you, I've said to many people, analytic philosophy is trench warfare. You fight and you fight and you fight and you move the front a few inches, and then you have another fight and you retreat a couple of inches. And the idea is after several years, eventually, either there'll be a breakthrough or the enemy will starve. And the most recent work on World War I is that Germany was not in that bad an economic situation. But whatever the point is, it's a long, long process, and you establish very little, although cumulatively, that may end up going somewhere eventually. So in that essay, I was trying to be very analytic. My goal was not to discuss what is true or not true. My goal was to raise a question. If you are in a particular position, namely, you're starting out from absolute skepticism, assuming that that's possible. On the other hand, you have some reason to try to latch on to this Judaism business. Then what's the reasonable next step? And to me, the reasonable next step is find out more about it. Experience it more fully. If you don't experience it, you'll be missing the most important dimension. That was the argument I was making. Now, in the middle, I may have been smuggling in something of my own reason, what I consider important. But the major argument was, if you're a rational person, where do you start? You don't start from pure reason because you're a human being. A human being is a combination of a lot of factors. You have a large toolkit, to use a phrase that I borrowed from Wittgenstein, that includes various intuitions, various modes of reasoning, and you use whatever's in that kit. And part of that kit is understanding what's really the issue with religious people. And here I would say, and I didn't emphasize this earlier today, that very often, especially if we think in terms of argument and proof and so forth, we miss out on the experiential aspect of religious life. When you look at real religious people, there's something about them that you have to be exposed to, you have to study, you have to relate to in order to either reject them or accept what they're doing. From that point of view, studying history and literature may be chas v'sholom better than studying philosophy.
It actually leads me to where I really want to get to, which is, I guess it's something I'm grappling with. I don't want to superimpose my own doubts on what I may hear whispers beneath your own words, but I can't help but think that you live in rarefied religious air. You have been exposed to the greatest mentors, obviously, Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Rabbi Walter Wurzburger. You have been immersed in the greatest of philosophy and literature. And what actually puzzles me to a degree about you is how the experience remains so rich when, and again, I am maybe guilty of superimposing my own struggles onto what I sometimes hear you grappling with, is that when you look out into your average Orthodox community and you go to Bergenfield and you go to, I don't know, some major, I don't mean to single out Bergenfield or the Five Towns, Boca, anywhere, a lot of the majesty of religious life is not there. You don't necessarily imbibe it. You don't necessarily see that beauty that maybe you're able to describe so eloquently in your words. And I sometimes sense, I don't want to call it doubt, but almost fatigue. In your concluding article as editor of Tradition, I could not help but notice that the title of that article was Lost Cause, conclusion in which nothing is concluded. And I sensed a bit of fatigue in almost, can we ever be successful in moving the Orthodox community and what values we embody and experience, though that the experiential world of Orthodox Judaism actually matches up with the values that are so faithfully transmitted by these rarefied individuals, which I will include you in, and you would include Rev Soloveitchik and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rabbi Walter Wurzberger and your mentors and people who inspired you. But then sometimes you look out and it's the experience itself which is left wanting. And you feel like there is a majesty in religious life, but who are my brethren in arms in this? And I'm wondering for you, how do you find nourishment in the experience of contemporary Orthodox life? Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe that's why the academy where you have built your life has been so comforting and nurturing. But for many who reach out to me, at least, they're not in the academy anymore. They're not in the base medrash anymore. They're in, your local synagogue, your local shul, and they look around, and the grandeur which I think you do capture, and our teachers and these individuals do capture, is so often wanting in those spaces. So I'm curious if that's something that you've ever grappled with, and do you think in a way that the grandeur of religious experience is a lost cause of sorts?
First, to go back to the title, the phrase lost cause is not mine. I borrowed it from T.S. Eliot, as I made it very clear in the article.
Yes. And
T.S. Eliot wrote in a passage that I quoted from his essay on Pitch Bradley, there is no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a one cause. Well, that's the nature of life. The most important causes, you don't get an immediate up or down. As we're speaking, it just occurs to me at this very moment, would Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass have thought that they were dealing with a one cause? And if they did, they may have been a little premature. I mean, the real issues, and I'm not saying this is a left winger, I'm not. But if you think of the history of enslavement as a serious problem for the American ideals of democracy, this has not gone away easily. And people are struggling on these fronts, whether I agree with their tactics or their goals or not. Those of the more realistic know that this is a very long battle. The other factor in the title, conclusion which nothing is concluded, really makes the same point. That's taken from Samuel Johnson, the last chapter of his novel, Rasselas. It's called A Conclusion Which Nothing is Concluded. I'm not as original as I pretend to be. Part of what you're asking, I don't think what you're asking directly, is biographical. I think that one reads everything that I've written, realize that there was certainly a stage where, as I put it in my eulogy for Rabbi Lichtenstein, how my life would turn out was not a foregone conclusion. There was a lot in the modern orthodoxy way, way back that seemed very indifferent, didn't seem to be serious at all. It seemed to be sociological. I'm not speaking only in terms of Shmir Mitzvot, but in terms of deeper attitudes. There was much that you could satirize, and much that I probably have satirized in the course of my life. The Rebbe of mine, whom people usually don't mention that quickly, was a factory worker who in a period when Shmir Shabbos was fairly rare in the immigrant community. He not only was Shmir Shabbos, but he found time to learn Gemara every day, and even...
Who is this? This was your actual Rebbe?
This is my father.
Ah, okay.
My father was able to, having left formal education at the age of 8 or 9, cause of poverty, as I understand it, he was able to reach a point where he could give a shiur to Balabatim. It may not be the kind of shiur you would have today where you quote 100 achronim. His library was limited. He knew what was important to him, wasn't. But he was able to do that. And he was serious about religion. It's a memory that I have with me. For some reason, it's always springtime or fall, maybe because I was home at that time. His Mincha Ma'ariv wasn't that early as it would be in the wintertime or as late as it would be in the summertime. But I remember him standing in the living room, davening Mincha, davening Ma'ariv. And I don't think I understood very much about the philosophy of tefillah, what I read in the Rav or in other writers. I didn't even know that much about the halachot of tefillah, but I understood that this was a serious business, and that for him, these things were serious business. Nonetheless, later on, I learned a little bit more about the politics of religion, and it was not edifying. It was not edifying at all. I wrote a eulogy for Rav Ovadia Yosef, who at a certain point in my development was a kind of breath of fresh air. There was a certain integrity to him, with a certain down-to-earth quality to him, and that even some of the factors that I later grew away from in terms of his way of characterizing opponents, even that struck me as being refreshing in a certain way. Now, I could have learned other things from him, things that I would be ashamed of having learned, but these were people that I looked at. There were teachers that I had, may not have been the most brilliant people in the world. Some of them were very bright people in B'nai Torah, and that meant something to me. It also meant something to me that I never felt that I am obligated, that if I want to be frum, that I have to shut out any other kind of wisdom. In that sense, there's a certain kind of frumkeit that I did not get at home, thank God. There is a certain kind of narrowness that I was not given at home. And Oiv Rabbi Lichtenstein, in his essay, The Source of Faith is Faith Itself, he mentions towards the beginning that he grew up in a home. It was a home where there was a lot of pressure on him to succeed in all respects. But he grew up in a home where his parents could speak very openly about things that are wrong in the frum community, without any snideness, without any cynicism. But he grew up knowing this is the way things are. And nobody, at least the people who were responsible for him, did not feel the need to hide that. So these are issues that affected me early. When I looked for the Rebbeim, whom you mentioned earlier, I looked for them precisely because I already had some idea of what kind of person I'm willing to learn from and I'm willing to take seriously. If you would ask me about the metaphysics and epistemology involved, I don't know if I would have done a good job, but I understood that if I'm serious about these things, just as it was important for me to learn from my father, just as it was important for me to learn from a lot of other people, from and not from people, it was also important for me to try to figure out what somebody like Rabbi Lichtenstein is about, what somebody like the Rav is about, what somebody like Rabbi Wurzburger is about, what, I don't want to mention names, but what some of my friends who are my age, and these are people that I valued very much, that had a great impact on me. These are people who sometimes cocked an eyebrow at me, and instantaneously I realized that the way I had been thinking before was not the only way of thinking, and it's probably the wrong way of thinking. So that's very important. Now, if you want to do that, again, I was fortunate that I had those opportunities. There are people who don't have those opportunities. I mentioned a recent article, a young man, Baal Tshuva, who asked me at one point, he said, now that I reached wherever I've reached, what kind of a community can I really be part of? And a few years later, he wrote to me, he said he is spending a lot of his free time in a yeshiva. He did not grow up in the kind of yeshiva that I grew up in. So he had to take whatever's in the neighborhood. And he's coming with serious questions in Gemara and Tanakh. And they're giving him pep talks. They're not really getting down and working. And they're talking about how proud they are that they are getting down and working, but there's much more pep talk than actual production. What you can say in that case, look, go out there, learn from whoever you can learn from. And remember, I'm including in this people that I've never, who are dead, Gedolim who are not around, people who are dead for hundreds of years. And remember, I'm including people outside of the film world. I mean, people tell me T.S. Eliot was an anti-Semite. I know that, but I learned from him. Samuel Johnson, Kierkegaard may have been eccentric in his own ways, but these are people that I've lived with. Now, the question that you'd ask further is, what happens if people don't have that opportunity? One problem, what if they don't have the background in Torah? And this haunts me because I can't fully relate to that, because when I was at that stage, I had the background. I could go to an advanced shiur, I could relate to the best Rosh Yeshiva, and I could even relate to them if they only spoke Yiddish. I had those tools, the tools in philosophy and literature and so on. Eventually, it was not that hard for me to pick that up. I was willing to put in the time, but I had those opportunities. What if you don't have that? What if you're a very bright person? You don't have the skills in Torah. You may end up sitting in a shiur where most of the people have no sense of what you're thinking about. And even a Maggid Shiur may not really fit you in terms of your sheer ability to think and to question. When I wrote about this, I said, well, we have Zoom, we've got all these other opportunities, and there are people who pick up email. There are times when I really get a lot of people who keep writing to me about personal matters. And there are times when I don't get those notes. There's cycles in that. But there's certainly people who are not embarrassed. And the people who write me very often write other people as well. My dear friend, Rabbi Yaakov Elman, Zichrono Livracha,
My Rebbe.
we would almost know that if this guy wrote to me, he must have written to Elman as well. And on one occasion, I sent my response to a third person, taking out the reference, any personal reference, sent to a third person. And that person wrote back, and here's what I wrote to so-and-so. So there are people who are not, sometimes they're nudniks, but very often they're serious people. So they can pick that up, but it still is difficult. And then you can get annoyed if you're with people. For that, I am really not good at that. When I was young, I could be very cynical. People are that way. Whatever doubts they have about themselves, they project onto other people. You know it, I know it, and maybe less so today, but I have a good memory. And that's something where you have to make an effort. Be autobiographical. Now, I could do that at great length, but to save time, I quote one person whom I gained a lot. His name was Rabbi Norman Frimmer. His sons at Nevesim are still around, they're productive people. And Rabbi Frimmer used to tell me, do you realize that the people you're looking at are cripples? And he said, it's not just the Holocaust, which usually you dismiss things. They came to an alien culture. They came without intellectual tools. They had to adjust in a very alien world. I have said sometimes to non-Jewish audiences, where there's similar fatigue among my Christian friends as well. And sometimes I've said, you realize that the world that I inhabit now, okay, my father got here early before World War I, but most of us in the rabbinical world reached the United States late. Many of them were physically broken. Many of them had lost their families. Even the one with a doctorate from the University of Berlin had to learn English and had to learn United States from scratch. And these people had the courage, or to use the Rav's daughter's term, the emunah, to come here and to do things. I mean, the Rav started Maimonides at a point where the idea of not sending your children to public school was kfira.
Sure.
It was unacceptable. This was the only road to Americanization. That he opened a kollel for European guys who could handle his shiurim. Okay, other people could do that also. But to make that experiment It's amazing. So where we are now, compared to where you were in the 1940s, people could very well say we're much better off than we were in the 1940s. And can that be total self-deception? Where we go from here, I don't know. Again, we talked about the people who are motivated, but they don't have the same opportunities that I had, that other people had in my circles. What we do next, I mean, how much of a community is there for the kind of class that I'm trying to give in a variety of areas? Maybe a lot of disappointment. Be a lot of frustration. If I give a shiur to Balabatim, sometimes if people are prepared and they're on you.
Sure.
Very often, if people, you're lucky if they understand what's bothering me, and you see that they understand what's bothering me if they can ask a good question afterwards. But you don't know if they understand what the other part of what I'm presenting is. But it's not purely a religious issue. It also has to do with the people's ability to concentrate, the ability to do disciplined work. And my colleagues at other universities are complaining as well. They're saying that the Zoom interlude destroyed any kind of ability to think clearly and the like. It may be that there are other factors as well, but that's the world that we're in. There are Rabbanim who achieve a lot under those conditions. I don't think that I would. I hope that I'm accomplishing something in Yeshiva.
No, I think you accomplished a tremendous amount. I'm curious, when you look now towards the Orthodox world, where do you find experiential nourishment? Where do you turn? A lot of your response focused on the past. I'm curious where you turn in the present moment to nourish yourself.
Some of my students are, they may not have that much experience, but some of them reflect intelligence and enthusiasm and sometimes maturity. That means a lot.
I wanted to kind of come back to the larger project, maybe the cause that you are trying to achieve. When you look at the issues facing religious life, religious conviction, there are a lot of darts that are thrown, and it's almost a cyclicality. I mentioned in our opening biblical criticism. There are issues now that relate to morality, particularly in the moment, and how we think about and consider the LGBT community in light of halachic restrictions. There's always going to be people who are bothered by theodicy and the question of how bad things could happen to good people in the presence of evil in the world. There are all these different categories, nearly all of which that you have contributed or addressed in one way or another over the history. What issue facing religious conviction, which of these darts do you find the most concerning and that the most work still needs to be done in order to address people who are grappling with faith in the modern world?
When I was a teenager, I would say theodicy. That's an issue that you can't simply turn your back on. You talk about biblical criticism. So there are people whose business it is to know about these things. If anybody wants to study Tanakh seriously, there's a point where they're consciously or unconsciously will be dealing with these problems. I don't know if we should call them problems even, with data that may deserve to be looked at seriously. It does not bother me that, say, the majority of the people who hear me discuss Chumash Shalosh Shudas don't realize that sometimes I'm playing with these considerations as well. I once wrote an article on Vayikra, which had no reference to biblical criticism at all. Yaakov Elman glanced at it and he said, well, you solved this problem, but you didn't really contribute anything on that issue. But not everybody thinks that way. The question of evil or suffering is something that we can't really avoid. For somebody to say, well, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, is not correct. The kind of things that you hear sometimes when people are sitting Shiva are either ridiculous or insulting. So there, I think it's important for people. It's not a challenge to people living religious lives, or at least formally, but in terms of depth, if you cannot take that into account, if you cannot absorb that kind of insight, if you can't live in that kind of world, there's something missing, and something you can't solve in one fell swoop. Sit down, you're sitting Shiva and read 10 prakim and 1 nevuchim. Even if you read those prakim with the Rav's interpretation and my interpretation, that's not the end of the story. It's only a beginning. That really leads me to so-called moral issues. I think very specifically about the homosexual question. You have to begin by recognizing that the film community, to a very large extent, uttered nonsense in this for many years.
What do you mean by that?
The idea of reparative therapy. Even if you're a big believer in psychotherapy, the idea that a small number of clinical psychologists have hit upon some way of transforming people that doesn't make sense to anybody else, you realize that either this was giving people false hope, or, as one of my colleagues who's no longer alive put it to me, it's wasting people's money. Either one is a bad thing. And the allowance that was given to certain kinds of pejorative statements, it lowered the people who made the comments. And I can only imagine the impact that it had on people for whom this was a real question, either for themselves or for people close to them. Now, I have been picking an issue where at one time I viewed myself being very liberal, and now I'm apparently very benighted, but I haven't moved. If I tie this to the previous point, it goes back to the question of theodicy at a certain level. It's a whole different conversation now. But if your theodicy is that God's in his heaven and one size fits all, and we're all in the same roller coaster, then if there's somebody who doesn't fit, or somebody who's called upon to sacrifice or to achieve things with great difficulty, to fail at certain things professionally or personally, then that person is an outsider. That person has been shifted to the outside circle. If you have a conception of hashgacha pratit, which is essential, again, if we go back to theodicy, then you have a personal destiny with God. You have your unique situation. As the Rav like to put it, every person has their own shade of color that they have to add to the world. If you think in those terms, then your way of thinking about these matters is going to be completely different. The question again is, what if you have somebody who is within a religious community but has not thought about hashgacha that way? That's where the philosophical therapy has to begin. What if you're dealing with people who have been given a very opposing and very insulting model of thinking about themselves or thinking about people close to them? That is, again, a very serious problem. And again, the notion of hashgacha pratit, where you sit around saying, isn't it wonderful that on 9/11, I had a headache that morning and I didn't go to work? And isn't it wonderful that my mother-in-law did not have a headache and she did go to the World Trade Center that day? That's a stupid way of thinking. So there's a balance here between this more populist idea of hashgacha and an idea where we in the Rabbi Shalom are together, and we have to make sense out of this. I'm thinking as we speak, a woman, not at all religious in conventional sense of the word, which is a member of ethical culture, blind from birth, achieved a great deal in her life, and was an authority on disability issues and other similar matters. She was dying of cancer, and we spent a few hours together. And she spoke about how her life plan had included marriage and children, and now she saw it was not going to work out that way. Included other things, which side by side with all the things she did achieve, there were the things that didn't go the way she wanted to. And we spent hours discussing how such experiences would appear different to a person who believes in God in a more traditional way, or somebody who does not. That was a very serious conversation. And I think it would be important if we could take ourselves seriously and also have a sense of humor about ourselves. I think we take God much more seriously as well.
I cannot thank you enough. There's something so deeply moving, and I love that term, philosophically therapeutic, about speaking with you and reading your words. I always end my interview with more rapid fire questions, so you can condense your answer to these. These are kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I should thank you for all the wonderful praise, but as my cousin once said to me at a dinner where he's being honored, sent me a note. He said, know that on these occasions, people don't always say everything that they mean. And they don't mean everything that they say. Okay, please continue.
Well, we'll leave that to our listeners to figure out, but I do mean it. My rapid fire questions, I always have 3. My first question, and you can answer this, we don't need the entire library, but aside from the books that we've already mentioned, if someone is coming to you and is looking to find a way to anchor their faith in something more real, to figure out how to ground their faith, what are your favorite books to recommend people who are grappling with these issues?
Again, I'm biased in terms of the Rav, in terms of Rabbi Lichtenstein.
Sure.
And Lichtenstein, I really don't know his written work that well because I heard it all in a draft. So I'm not I'd say there's a lot that you can learn from somebody like C.S. Lewis. There's a lot of common sense that you can get from something like Chesterton. And these are things that are light reading. They're not demanding. In Chesterton's case, you have to look away from anti-Semitism. But I think there are novels that force a person to think seriously about moral issues and the like.
What's a novel that you would recommend? We don't get so much fiction recommendations. I think it would be wonderful to hear a novel that has prompted you to think religiously.
I was not going to say religiously, but George Eliot,
okay,
who was raised very seriously religiously, and it never quite left her. Virginia Woolf said that Middlemarch was one of the few novels written for adults. In terms of thinking about moral issues and being sensitive to moral issues, it's very important. And it's not the only thing that people should be reading, but it shows you a mind working who was very careful about these kinds of matters. There are a lot of insights, and we want to go back to the beginning. Chumash and Rashi, Chumash and Ramban.
Sure.
But I think that would be cheating. In this context, that would be cheating.
Yeah, well, not necessarily. I remember when I asked, I had an interview recently with Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, the Rav's son, who I'm sure you know well, and I asked him for a book recommendation for understanding the Talmud better, and he recommended the Rif. He said that that's the best way to do it. So that's similar to, recommending the classics, Chumash, Rashi. My next question I always ask our guests, and it's actually a 2-parter. I usually ask one part, but I'm curious if you'll answer the second part. I always ask my guests, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical, to go back to school and get a PhD, what would the subject and title of that PhD be? And my part 2 for you, which is unique to you, is that what's always intrigued me is that you have always been in the university but never pursued an actual PhD. So I'm curious if you could say, if you were to go back and write a PhD, what would it be on? And why is it that you never decided to get a PhD?
I had all the credits. And I was not yet busy doing everything I was doing. I figured I may as well get the credits, and that way I have the freedom to either go ahead or not go ahead. So credits are there.
Which school were you in?
I was at City in philosophy in the Graduate Center, and in Rebel I was doing Jewish philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I had the credits, but...
your ability to finish a PhD is not suspect. I hope that's clear.
I was busy doing the things that I wanted to do, which would require a breadth that would not be available within the normal academic world, and would involve a willingness to be very open about religious issues in a way that I don't think is common. I know that in Lichtenstein's doctorate, there's one place where he says very openly, people for whom religious considerations, et cetera, and I count myself one of them. He was out in the open. But normally, that there are impediments to doing that. It was more important for me to move ahead doing the things that I thought were important. Presumably, if I had the time to pursue these, I really don't know what I would do. One possibility, do something in Talmud. I think I'm interested enough in the intersection of yeshivish learning and academic Talmud. So take all the arguments that I had with Yaakov Elman for 35 years and do something with it. The other level, in a completely different way, I could sit down and want to study economics because I feel that there my knowledge is secondhand. And if I really knew it from the bottom up, the way somebody knows it who's studying it professionally. It would help me in Batra, it would help me in other areas. And I have been an affiliated scholar at Cardozo Law School. It would help me there. So that would be an option. Or get a law degree and function as a full-time expert on philosophy of law and halacha and general law. But I don't see that those are things that are going to happen.
No, and I'm so glad that you continued writing and contributing in the way you did. My last question, I'm always curious about people's schedules. And I always wonder, what time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
The simple answer, when I'm tired, I sleep. When I'm not tired, I'm awake. I think it's varied over the years. Probably in later years, I wake up a lot earlier most of the time.
What's early? We love giving, a data range.
If I wake up at 5 o'clock, I may actually get up and get going. And I don't sleep if I'm tired at a certain point, take a nap. If the nap turns out to take too long, then it ends up being a night's sleep.
I love that answer.
I take a very casual attitude. I remember a doctor not too long ago was discussing certain issues with me. And at a certain point, he just said to me, what I know about you, I don't think you sleep too much. And I said, you're right, but not quite as right as you think you are. I was young. I trained myself to sleep very little. That faded away. What I benefited a lot from that is waking up quickly and falling asleep quickly. And that has been a help halachically in terms of the years my mother was needed help at night. But if she called out, I would wake up quickly. And if I didn't wake up quickly, she had a bicycle horn and that guy.
That's very sweet. Rabbi Carmy, I cannot thank you enough for your time and insight today and for all of your work and contributions to Jewish thought, religious thought over the years. It has been a distinct honor, privilege, and pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. And please again, forgive me for not responding to all the nice statements because, again, I assume that they reflect more what you want to be true than they actually achieved.
Rav Shalom Carmy is not your typical inspirational speaker. He speaks with great deliberateness and pause, and really listening to him for me was an exercise and a nourishing exercise in Yiras Shamayim itself, in somebody who's really committed their life to finding foundations and uncovering and building foundations for faith for his students, for his readers, and it's really such a pleasure to have spoken with him. In that final editor's note, which we spoke about in the conversation, which is called Lost Cause, a conclusion in which nothing is concluded. He ends with a really beautiful anecdote that I think relates to a lot of the work that we're doing on 1840. Again, this is his final editor's note when he was serving as editor-in-chief of Tradition, and he wrote as follows. My editorial involvement in Tradition began before I joined the board in 1979. Several years earlier, the Rav invited me, and he's referring to Rabbi Soloveitchik, of course, of the Rosh Yeshiva and Yeshiva University, invited me to assist him in preparing some of his writings for publication. The first installment was the special edition of 5 Tradition articles that appeared in 1978. This series included the Rav's eulogy of the Talner Rebbitzin, in which he depicted the dual aspect of our religious tradition, the essential role of the Jewish father and the Jewish mother. A few months later, the Rav handed me a letter he received. His correspondent had read the article carefully and appreciatively. What replacement, however, could the Rav propose for people who do not have the benefit of the ideal father and the ideal mother who the Rav so eloquently extolled? We spent some time weighing possible responses, none of which the Rav found satisfactory. Did the Rav intend to write back? No, because he didn't have a good answer. In that case, I asked, why did he give me the letter? The Rav looked at me in the eye and said very deliberately, Carmy, I want you to think about this. This anecdote adds one more ingredient to the profile of the Jewish thinker adumbrated above in this article. He or she must not only articulate Jewish convictions, insights, and arguments, but must also be sensitive to the questions for which we do not have clear-cut solutions. This is as true for the septuagenarian as it is for the young student. And what a beautiful ending, so to speak, a conclusion in which nothing is concluded, the sensitivities needed to answer questions for which we do not have clear-cut solutions. And I think in our return to rationality, I think this is an appropriate description, because I don't know that we've provided any clear-cut solutions more than emphasize the fact that we as a community of listeners, a community of people, of individuals, are all grappling with something similar and trying to find some path on which to ground our lives. And I think in this way, what Rabbi Carmy, at least for me, represents is somebody who is willing to really roll up their sleeves and figure it out and do the work to build a sanctified, sophisticated religious life, and shows us that it can in fact be possible. You know, I want to end with one quote that I've used a few times, but it's also from Rabbi Carmy, and I always come back to it because I think we live in an age and an era where it's too easy, unfortunately, not to embody. It's an article that talks about how we learn Chumash, how we learn Tanakh, how we study the Torah, and some of the ways in which we superimpose, psychological explanations for some biblical characters. Now, Rav Carmy is not entirely against that, but he does have some pushback, and I want to end our series on rationality with this pushback. One reason that people shrink the larger-than-life personalities of Tanakh to pop psychology size is that they are accustomed to treating themselves the same way. What characterizes pop psychology? Casual deterministic assumptions, cliched depictions of emotion, a philosophy that cannot grasp the dramatic, absolute, momentous solemnity of moral religious life. This is not the way I think of myself. It is not the way I think of you. It is not the way one should think about any human being created uniquely in the image of God. Once people see nothing wrong in entertaining secular conceptions of themselves, once they take for moral and psychological insight the tired idiom of the therapeutic, it's no wonder that they are tone deaf to the grandeur of the avot and imahot. And I think this condemnation, obviously not on the enterprise of sophisticated psychology, but on this kind of like pop psychology and superimposing it on any personality that you can't quite plumb the depths to, is a fitting ending in many ways to our return to the explanation of rationality. And it's important that we're able to approach ourselves and our own thinking and our own lives with what he calls the dramatic, absolute, momentous solemnity of the moral religious life. To appreciate, as he says, the complexity and sophistication of the human narrative and the human journey. And I think that when we reduce our religious lives to easy bite-sized answers and easy bite-sized solutions that just get us to point A to point Z so we could figure out and feel absolutely confident with the path of our lives, we are reducing ourselves in many ways to those cliched depictions of emotion and not grasping the dramatic, absolute, momentous solemnity that are our lives, religious or otherwise. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our team member and friend, Dina Emerson. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play in a future episode. That number, of course, is 917-720-5629. Once again, that's 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.